Let's imagine that the event was a planned false flag event, an alternate narrative that may explain why the operation was supposed to have gone a certain way, how it went off the rails, and why the improvised story that was then put forward as the mainstream and accepted narrative of events has holes in it. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. So the shooter retrieves his rifle and begins opening fire on the people in the Broad Arrow Cafe. Anthony Nightingale leaps to his feet and says, "No, not here," and is shot down. An unusual thing to say, of course, could be completely coincidental, but the possibility, we're dealing once again with an alternate narrative, is that some of the people in the Broad Arrow Cafe were associated with the operation, whether they were intelligence agencies or plants. This is also backed up to a certain extent by witness statements that Hans Overbeek, who was a local person who'd known around the local area, had also attended the Broad Arrow Cafe aftermath and was witnessed going through victims' pockets.
The doctor's telling me what I think. Another thing that happened, Hans Overbeek, he was very arrogant, quite nasty in the cafe when I walked in. One of the women that was hiding in the cafe said she saw him after the gunman left, going through people's pockets.
Jesus.
He's obviously looking for something.
Ostensibly, unless that person was stealing, they may have been removing any identification that would then classify the planted people as being operatives. Hans Overbeek has come under quite a lot of scrutiny and suspicion in relation to his involvement and also the possible involvement of his son Benjamin Overbeek, who also had committed suicide some months after Port Arthur. So the shooter has improvised. He has opened fire in the cafe and killed in a very short amount of time, in a very professional, ruthless and controlled, methodical manner, 20 people. He then exits the cafe calmly, as James Belasco reported, the US tourist who had videoed the shooter, like he was on a stroll.
Walked right by me, not far away from me, just walked out of there as casual as can be.
So this is a person that is not of an emotional instability and perhaps low IQ. This is a person very controlled, very calm, very controlled and methodical and professional. Neville Quinn had issued a witness statement that he said that the shooter was one of the best trained army men I'd ever seen. His stance was unbelievable. The shooter makes their way down to the buses and retrieves a firearm which Martin Bryant had stated to Inspectors Warren and Payne when he was interviewed that that's not one of mine, no, never. I've never seen that. This is the FN-FAL .308 semi-automatic rifle, a much more high-powered and accurate rifle. The shooting continues around the buses at greater distances, with victims sometimes being shot from one bus through the window into another bus. Very accurate shooting. The shooter makes their way down to the Volvo, gets in the Volvo and exits the Port Arthur historic site. This all takes place in a very short amount of time. Once again, a professional trained individual has the ability to control uncontrollable situations, to think on their feet, to improvise. And considering the multiple staged events of the shooting at Port Arthur, that certainly occurred. So we've got the change of plans. We've got the Broad Arrow Cafe as the first stage of the shooting. Then we've got the buses. The person then continues up the access road and shoots more victims on the way, including the horrific crime of shooting a mother and her 2 young children. This is a person totally devoid of any humanity and compassion, a psychopath. That person then is stopped at the toll booth. Now, once again, we have a strange anomaly, a weird coincidence, and an unexplained series of questions where a family who had driven up to the toll booth, who were intending to enter the Port Arthur historical site, had witnessed that both the access roads were blocked by vehicles. One was a bronze gold BMW and the other was Martin's yellow Volvo that was parked in the outgoing lane. We have covered this in a previous episode. Seated in the front seat of the BMW was a male and a female. Seated in Martin Bryant's Volvo, which was sitting just behind the BMW, probably about 6 metres behind, was the shooter. In the front seat was a female, Helene Salzman, and behind the gunman, in the rear seat, was Robert Salzman. The family, the Cheoks, were surprised at seeing that both roads were blocked at the toll booth, and as they watched, Robert Salzman exited the vehicle, the yellow Volvo, and stood there. He didn't run. Now just remember, just a few metres down the road, we've covered this, Annette Mikak and her 2 young daughters, Alana and Madeline, were ruthlessly killed. So the people that were parked at the toll booth would be very aware that there was shooting and that people would be being shot and that others would be running in panic. And yet 2 of them are seated in Martin Bryant's Volvo with the shooter, having a conversation. Robert Salzman gets out and stands at the rear of the Volvo. The shooter gets out. They have a conversation. They're standing fairly close together. At some point, the Cheoks witness that this turns into an argument. The gunman then shoots Robert Salzman. Russell Pollard, who is in the BMW parked adjacent, gets out, walks around, and also confronts the gunman. He then is shot as well. The gunman then drags out Helene Salzman and murders her by the side of the road before killing Rosemary Nixon, who was the female in the front of the BMW. If we consider once again, we're theorising an alternate narrative, that the reason that these 4 other people in another vehicle did not run, did not drive away, did not try to grab the rifle that was retrieved from the back of the Volvo. So remember, in the initial stages, they were seated together. There was no firearm present. This may suggest that those people were involved operatives and that the reason they had, in essence, accosted the gunman was that the plan had gone off the rails, that he was meant to be on the ferry, but he was not. He instead had shot up the Port Arthur historic site and made his way up towards the toll booth. So there was an argument that ensued. The gunman, who was a total psychopath, at this point had gone too far to change plans and decided no more loose ends and decided to execute the 4 of them before commandeering their vehicle, which is another improvisational ability, and then exit the Port Arthur historic site. The next improvised activity, of course, was that the gold BMW was then used to cut off a car that was exiting a service station which contained Glenn Pearce and his partner Zoe Hall. The gunman blocks the car from exiting, gets out and forces Glenn Pearce at gunpoint into the boot of the BMW. He then returns and shoots Zoe Hall in the car and kills her. I'm going to return once again that all this time Martin Bryant is stationed at Seascape with no knowledge of what's gone on whatsoever. He's waiting to take his part in the counter-terrorism exercise that's to take place later that afternoon. The gunman makes his way to the Seascape cottage. At the entranceway, at the driveway, he stops and he begins shooting at some of the other vehicles to lift the body count, if you like. So various people are shot as they're travelling on the access road outside the Seascape cottage driveway. Once again, witness statements see a man with long blonde hair in a dark coat. There are also reports of a different individual with mousy brown hair and a beard. Once again, this has not been determined. Possibility that there could have been someone else involved, but at this stage we're going to assume that the gunman has improvised once again and opened fire on innocent tourists. So then, the next stage of the plan is that the BMW is driven onto the grounds of Seascape. Glenn Pearce is in the boot of the BMW. The gunman enters the Seascape cottage. The operatives are there. We have Rick and we have Jamie, which is Martin Bryant's chosen role as the terrorist. He says, change of plans. We have a hostage now. We have a real hostage. So Martin, you're going to say that you have hostages and your job will now be to take care of the hostages. Now, Glenn Pearce is either brought in and handcuffed to the railing inside Seascape Cottage, and Martin is given the appointed task of looking after the hostages, as he states in his police negotiation later with negotiator Terry McCarthy. I'm making sandwiches for the hostages. They've got some egg and bacon, and I've got to go because the kettle is squealing downstairs.
I'm making up some sandwiches. These people have got salad and some bacon in them.
Right.
And eggs. I'm going to fry up some bacon and eggs for them.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I've got to go because this kettle's squealing downstairs, and I'm making a cup of tea now for the hostages.
In essence, he's supposedly looking after the hostage. Gunshots are clearly heard during this amiable conversation in the background, which means Rick, who is the other operative, is shooting out the window and the beginning of the siege is taking place. Reports start to emanate that shooting had been taking place near the Seascape cottage. So the police begin to arrive. The first two constables on the scene at the Seascape cottage are Constables Paul Hyland and Gary Whittle. They pull up and are immediately fired upon. The rounds are accurate enough that they have to draw to a safe distance. The reports were that on arrival they saw that the BMW was burning, that it had caught fire. The mainstream narrative was that Martin had set fire to the car. This may have happened either with Glenn Pearce in the boot, or Glenn Pearce had been removed and handcuffed to the railing. At some point the car was set on fire. Andrew Fogarty, who was a Taspol Special Operations Group, had arrived very, very shortly after Constables Gary Whittle and Paul Hyland had. There were some reports that they were surprised at how quickly a Special Operations Group police had managed to attend the Seascape cottage. Nevertheless, let's imagine that someone had fired an incendiary device into the BMW to prevent any kind of escape from the Seascape cottage, therefore making sure that Martin Bryant had no options whatsoever to be able to escape, that he would have to remain at the cottage. Remember, the yellow Volvo had been abandoned back down at the toll booth with his passport in the glove box. So, the siege begins, and we have Jamie, who's shooting out the window with Rick and with the gunman, and we perhaps have a hostage there as well. Terry McCarthy contacts the Seascape cottage. In essence, the police were informed that the cottage was the location for the shooter because an ABC reporter by the name of Alison Smith had by chance been ringing around local areas to see if there were what was going on with Port Arthur, and they had the number for the Seascape cottage and rang. That phone was answered by a voice of the person saying, I'm having a lot of fun, and if you call again, I'll shoot the hostages. Alison Smith then passed this information on to the police, which then, of course, enabled the police to be able to attend the Seascape cottage where the siege took place. If we return a little bit back to the Port Arthur historic site, the scene of massive carnage and a massacre, the police had gathered in force at Turana. There was Marine Police, there was Special Operations Group that were flown in from the mainland, from New South Wales, Victoria Police. There was an enormous contingent of police that were mustered at Turana. However, it took 6 hours before those police converged in force at the Port Arthur Historic Site, leaving people like Wendy Skua and many of the other survivors having to deal with panicked tourists and a scene of carnage and performing triage on the victims before any real help arrived.
The problem is I made a phone call there at 1:32 to the police. I was so upset that nobody come to help us. We waited till about 7:30, 20 to 8 for an ambulance or a police car.
Yeah, there was a lot of mention of the fact they mobilised everything from the Special Operations Group to the Marine Police, but they were basically held up and they were told just hold off at Turana.
They were kept at Turana. They had the barbecue. One of the blokes come down and got his wife, and he just drove through a roadblock. He said, ask the police down there. They said, no, they're having a barbecue at Turana, and it was too dangerous for them to come in. And I have in the EMA report, which is a federal government document, where they didn't come in. It's all there, because it was too dangerous.
So why? Once again, if we put the overlay of the operation, why didn't the SOG police immediately attend Port Arthur Historic Site immediately after the shooting had taken place? Why did it take 6 hours? Why were they held back there and in essence had a barbecue? A possible alternative to that is because the operation had gone awry and the Isle of the Dead was no longer the scene of the crime, that there was a problem because there was public access from all avenues to the Port Arthur Historic Site. There were multiple witnesses. There were an unpredictable series of circumstances and people that would blow holes in the original narrative of the massacre at the Isle of the Dead. This had to be controlled while a new narrative was formed. So 6 hours, the police were kept at Turana, and the directive was given it's too dangerous for them to enter. Now, given we had Special Operations Group police whose job it is to take point on dangerous situations, particularly involving firearms, it's inconceivable that they wouldn't have rushed in, at least the tactical police. So this gives time for the people who had planned the operation to then start to theorise how they could salvage the chain of events that had totally changed the circumstances of the crime. If we backtrack a little bit, the original target was the Isle of the Dead. If that had gone successfully, there wouldn't have been any need for a siege at Seascape. It was purely the location that was chosen there to, in essence, keep Martin Bryant, who was the chosen patsy, and also implicate him in the murders of David and Sally Martin, which would also give him additional motive, planting the idea that there was a grudge between Martin Bryant and the Martins because they didn't sell one of their properties to his father, who had committed suicide. Once again, it creates a chain of evidence or motive which can be attributed to Martin Bryant. But if the Isle of the Dead had been successfully assaulted by the gunman, there would not have been a need for a siege to occur at Seascape. However, once the operation went off the rail, then the siege became real. So the operatives, including Jamie, are firing out of the window. And the notion behind that is that, once again, they're not allowed to kill any police, but they have to keep the police at bay. So the shooting is very, very accurate. Soon after, Constable Pat Allen arrives at the entrance to Seascape and is fired upon. He takes cover behind his vehicle, his police vehicle, and the firing is very, very accurate, so that the bullets are striking the front bumper bar of his car, of his police cruiser. He's later forced to retreat to a culvert. Police then are pinned down for hours because the shooting is very, very accurate from the Seascape cottage, However, no police are killed or injured. They are, however, kept at bay. 6 hours later, we've had the police en masse that were kept at Turana have arrived at the Port Arthur Historic Site, basically entered there to take charge of a very compromised crime scene. So in those hours, people were trampling over evidence, souveniring empty cartridge cases.
We had no tape round time, so there we were, 31 of us, to look after 500 people. So that wasn't until after 7:30 that someone came in. They came in and protected the crime scene. Now you see photos of the broad arrow with the blue and white tape around it. That crime scene was not protected. And all those poor people that had dead people in there, they were allowed to go in. We never had the authority to stop them. So she was wide open. All the evidence was getting, bullets were being taken off the floor. But what can we do?
It was a totally compromised site, which perhaps could have been of benefit to anyone planning the operation, because then they could say, well, we can't have any investigation because the scene is compromised. The Special Operations Group converge on the Seascape Cottage, and as stated before, there is a siege where shots are being fired. Tactics are that lights are being turned on and off. There are distractions, noises and smashing furniture. And the reports by attending police were that initially there seemed to be multiple shooters at the Seascape Cottage, including reports that shots were coming from different angles and different locations. So now we have a bit of a problem, because the patsy, which is Martin Bryant, can only be the person that is the sole perpetrator of the shooting that has now taken place at the Port Arthur Historic Site, as opposed to the Isle of the Dead and the ferry. We have operatives inside the Seascape Cottage. We have police surrounding. Night falls. At some point, a firearm with night vision equipment is used to be able to keep a check on all of the encroaching Special Operations Group police to make sure that they don't get too close.
Yes, hello, how are you?
Oh, very well, thanks, Jamie. Yourself?
Well, I'm well up till now, in the past few 20 seconds. What I've actually found out, man, is that one of your boys is right outside, north-east, I'd say, with an infrared scope. Can you just ask him to move on?
Oh, we'll do that. We'll do that now.
Is he going to shoot? He's kind of shoot. He's going to shoot. We'll make a man.
There is also a very high likelihood that a police radio is present, because at some point Martin Bryant, who is taking the pseudonym Jamie, says, what I've just found out is that one of your boys is on the northeast corner. It's just a use of word, but he doesn't say, what I've spotted is one of your boys on the northeast corner. He says, what I've just found out. Possibility then that, and most likely, that any operatives would have had some form of police communication to be able to keep a check on what was taking place down at Port Arthur, to monitor the situation in essence. Jamie says that he does have a rifle with night vision equipment. He does state that he can see one of the Special Operations Group on the northeast corner with an infrared scope, and he says, I've got one of these scopes that's on these rifle. Do you want me to tell you the name of it? It's a laser scope. So in essence, he has some kind of device, line of sight device, to be able to pinpoint Special Operations Group police at night time. So now we have an issue. We have the patsy, who's now clearly identifying himself as a person involved in the siege. However, Terry McCarthy, the police negotiator, is on the phone to Jamie, and they have to once again continue the breadcrumb trail that's been created right from the start, all the way through and all the way back. So Jamie is not identifying himself. He's calling himself Jamie. He's mentioning that he's with Rick. He says he knows Rick well. He knows Rick's wife, and says that she is high up. Terry McCarthy asks, I don't know what you mean by that. And he says, you know, in intelligence and the universities and everything. Perhaps a bit of a slip up, that Martin Bryant had given away that there was intelligence involved in the operation, because remember, he thinks he's part of an operation. He's told, of course, when they have the hostage, that the new story is that he had taken the hostage at gunpoint and forced him into the BMW and taken him back to Seascape, and that there was an explosion and somehow Glenn Pearce must have died in the car. This is the only recollection Martin Bryant has of his involvement in any kind of violent activity involving Port Arthur. When Terry McCarthy is talking to Jamie, he says, we've got this situation with you having a siege and there's the shooting at Port Arthur. Martin had asked, what's gone on at Port Arthur? And Terry had replied, there's been a shooting, and Martin's response as Jamie was, oh, they weren't killed, as a question, which is once again an unusual thing to say. Someone who had just taken part in killing 35 men, women and children and injuring 28 others would have a very clear idea of what they had accomplished. But he literally said, oh, they weren't killed. Now, this is also a person that, if it was Martin Bryant, as the mainstream narrative claimed, he's supposedly just murdered men, women and children with impunity. And yet he has the opportunity to shoot police with night vision equipment. And instead of doing so, he warns them off. Once he says, I've spotted one of your men on the northeast corner, he says to Terry McCarthy, can you tell him to move back? And Terry McCarthy replies that they will do that. They don't want to see anyone hurt. Why would not Martin Bryant, if he was the sole perpetrator, shoot the police officer? Unless part of the operation is that it's a false operation. He's not meant to shoot any police. No police are meant to die. It's still part of the operation. So now we come to the conclusion of that operation. And there's been some very hasty discussions about how to re-engineer, if you like, the story, because the Isle of the Dead had failed as an operational parameter. So at some point, Martin is drugged. Martin was always intended as the patsy to die without any chance to being questioned or cross-examined or anything. He's meant to die, and he was meant to die and be transported to the Isle of the Dead. However, because that failed, now we have him in the Seascape cottage, and at some point the cottage is set on fire, purportedly by Martin Bryant, but most likely by the operatives. Under cover of darkness, joined the very limited cordon around the Seascape cottage. If some of these operatives were Special Operations Group police, then we had SOGs from New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. It would be very hard to consider that anybody who was a Special Operations Group police officer was not part of the surrounding cordon. Martin is drugged. He's thrown down, face down, either on the floor or on the bed, and the cottage is set on fire. This is at the outbreak of dawn and the morning, the early morning. Martin, of course, is meant to burn to death in the fire, along with the bodies of the Martins and or Glenn Pearce. Martin wakes up on fire. We know that his back and lower half on the rear were burnt, not his front. He runs out of the building, takes off his clothes, and these are black clothing once again, and is arrested by the Special Operations Group who converge on him. And one of them says, quote, he was smiling and laughing and out with the fairies, which once again indicates that he may have been drugged. Now, the only knowledge that the chosen patsy has of what has occurred is that he was taking part in a police exercise and that there was some kind of shooting down at Port Arthur of which he was unaware, and that he's given the story to relate that he had kidnapped Glenn Pearce at gunpoint and put him in the boot of the gold BMW that had been commandeered. This is also why later on, when he recounts that recollection to Inspectors Warren and Payne, it's confused. And he reports that he had actually kidnapped Glenn Pearce at the Fortescue Bay Road turnoff, and that there was a woman there with a baby who said that she wanted to take part in the kidnapping. And that he said, well, I've got this bloke here, okay, hop in. Once again, suggesting that his belief was that it was, in essence, a charade, a false kidnapping. So then Martin is arrested, and all of the pieces are put together via witness statements. The Volvo, the passport is discovered in the glove box. Martin conveniently doesn't identify himself to Terry McCarthy during the negotiation, but at some point he readily offers up and rattles off his passport number to Terry McCarthy out of the blue. So suddenly they know that it's Martin Bryant. A photo is very quickly circulated of Martin Bryant, and he becomes the sole gunman for the Port Arthur massacre. The rest is history, of course. He's arrested and kept in solitary confinement for 5 months with very little access to information. And as reported in previous episodes, my understanding is he held a not guilty plea staunchly for something like 5 months before changing his plea to guilty, partly due to the manipulations of his so-called defence lawyer, John Avery, who had convinced his mother to show up to the prison and get him to change his plea. Otherwise, he would never see his mother or his sister Lindy again. Also, I have credible reports, that the confession was extracted under a protracted and sustained level of torture, and I mean very severe torture. So Martin Bryant, months later, gives an interview with Inspectors Warren and Payne. His behaviour during the interview is frivolous and laughing, almost treating the whole thing like it's a big joke.
Yeah, you're convinced now that there are 35 people dead?
I don't find that a very funny statement at all, mate, to be quite honest.
That he is unaware of the reality of what had actually transpired. And when told that 35 people had been killed, he gives a look of utter incredulity. Is quite shocked by that.
I've told you what you've done. What have I? You've killed 35 people.
So I guess to wrap all up, what I've just outlined is, of course, a hypothesis, an alternate narrative that may explain why the operation was supposed to have gone a certain way, how it went off the rails, and why the improvised story that was then put forward as the mainstream and accepted narrative of events has holes in it, unresolved questions, and why that also then necessitated a need to, in essence, create a cover-up to make sure that there would be no open trial, to make sure that there would be no coronial inquest or royal commission, that no evidence would be tendered, no firm, hard evidence, ballistics, forensics, DNA. The abandoned Volvo that was left at the toll booth was allowed to sit overnight with the windows down under very cold and precipitous temperatures. So much so that the following morning, any fingerprints and DNA were in essence washed away. Very convenient for a crime scene where you would imagine that they at least would have put some kind of tarpaulin over the Volvo. But the cover-up began. So to this day, there was no open trial, no coronial inquest, no royal commission, no hard evidence tendered in court. The origins of the firearms, the gun registers, never tendered in court. The video camera, which was mentioned earlier, if there was a tape, never seen the light of day. And the only thing, in essence, putting Martin in jail and sentencing him to consecutive life terms was his supposed confession and his later guilty plea in court many, many months later. And as a result, there was no need under law to conduct any kind of thorough investigation into Australia's largest and most heinous massacre in our history. he was in essence tossed in jail and they threw away the key. And to this day, the evidence has been locked down. Initially, it was locked down under the Hobart Supreme Court ban of 30 years from 1996, which would have expired in 2026. But as we know, the records from Port Arthur have since then been digitised and placed under the Tasmanian Archives Heritage Office for a further 75 years. So any evidence whatsoever has now been locked down till 2091. And there we have, in essence, an alternate narrative for what could have taken place at Port Arthur. This is just an opinion, or just an exploration, and why it would necessitate such a massive cover-up. Hopefully one day we will get the opportunity to dig deeper, to actually view a lot of this hard evidence. And I've always said the authorities could make all of this supposed conspiracy theory go away overnight if they just proved 100% beyond reasonable doubt that Martin Bryant was the sole perpetrator to the Port Arthur massacre. To this day, many thousands of Australians do not believe that that is the case, and they have been robbed of the opportunity to find the truth that they seek. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. New episodes will be uploaded every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Feel free to share far and wide, and please see the links to the Dropbox files and information relating to the episodes. Also, without any obligation, please see the Buy Me a Coffee campaign, which helps keep the channel running and also provides profits to my friends who are survivors from Port Arthur who have supported me on this journey. Thank you.